Well, here we are once again at the end of the month, and what a month it has been. Not only did we have the 10-year anniversary of Blurryface, the end of the Clancy tour, a devastating final letter from Clancy to the Torchbearer outlining his intention to take absolute power for himself, we also had a surprise announcement that 21 Pilots will be releasing a new album entitled Breach in September. The first single off of which will be coming out in less than 2 weeks at this point. So, welcome to the third installment of Ask Perligo, now officially rebranded as Perligo Ponders, in which I respond to your comments, questions, and theories related to my own comments, questions, and theories. As always, if you would like your comment to be featured, just comment something interesting down below, and you can feel free to flag it as a Perligo Ponders comment if you would like, but I don't just pull from comments which are flagged in that manner. Now, we have quite a lot to talk about today. Quite a number of interesting comments have come in over the past month. So, without further ado, let's get into it. The first comment comes from Bradley Dean, and he writes, "For Breach, I have a thought. The submarine from Saturday sinks, and then the dragon from that music video starts to come up. Maybe the dragon breaches. Maybe the next album will be about the dragon." Now, this is an interesting observation. I'm not sure that I quite agree with the conclusion which he reaches at the end, but it is true that in Saturday we do see a breach of the submarine carried out by Trash the Dragon after he has been seized by Keons. And one thing which has always bugged me a little bit about the Skilled and Icy era is that we were introduced to this dragon in Shy Away, and then by the time we get to Saturday, the dragon's already dead, and it's a little unclear what the role of the dragon was. It appears on the album art for the album. Like I mentioned, it appears briefly in Shy Away, and then we see it very clearly in Saturday and a little bit at the beginning of the Outside, but that's mainly as a recap for what we saw in Saturday. And again, when we see it in Saturday, it's already dead. That's how Keons is able to seize its lifeless corpse and use that to attack the submarine and help Clancy escape. But what happened with the dragon in between? We see it attacking and destroying things in Shy Away, but that's more of kind of a background thing that's happening while Josh and Tyler are playing. So is there some secret role that this dragon has in the story that either is yet to be revealed or has been and we didn't quite fully understand that it was? It also doesn't, unless I'm mistaken, unless I'm misremembering, the dragon doesn't appear anywhere in Clancy's journal, or his letters, or any of the other letters. It kind of just shows up in a bunch of this visual media and then is never mentioned, referenced, or returned to again, and its lifespan is strangely short. Now, because of that, or perhaps in spite of that, I don't think it's going to be featured prominently in Breach. It certainly won't be the main character of Breach. I think it would be very strange if this album were to focus on a character around which there is so little, if it's going to be the final album of the story. I think an album sitting where Clancy stood could have made sense to feature on the dragon if they wanted to make that a really prominent character somehow. But for it to be the main focus of the final album just seems like it's introducing and developing a character instead of working on ending the story. Now, that's not to say that we won't see the dragon once again seized, perhaps by one of the bishops or perhaps by Clancy, and used for the fight by either side. That could be possible. Or perhaps the dragon's still alive, or there are more dragons. It's a little unclear. It also seems like the dragon was something of a sea creature rather than your traditional cave-dwelling land-based dragon. But again, we know very little about this creature. All that is to say, this is an interesting and thought-provoking theory. It's hard to say much more about it, but it is true and important to remember that we did see a breach of the submarine in Saturday. Moving on to the next comment, which again is about the video for Saturday, which is interesting because I never made a video talking about Saturday at all in May. But nonetheless, it is a significant and interesting topic for conversation. Lightning Bolt YT asks, what year is the story set in, because in the music video for Saturday has shown boats. It shows boats. I wish I could tell you, because I've been wondering myself, and this is something which I touched upon a bit in the video I did discussing the letters, the FPE letters written by the Banditos and the citizens of Dima. In the Scaled and Icy era, we see a certain use of technology, and it seems to be somewhat older technology. For instance, in the control rooms, in the television sets, in the studio that they produce the live stream experience from, or that, in which Good Day Dima is hosted. But there is no explicit mention of a particular year in which this story is set, and given that it is a story taking place in a fantasy world, and it is a piece of fantasy fiction, it's a little hard to pinpoint exactly what year, or even to try to map particular years onto that world, which line up with years from our world. But while I can't say definitively, it is interesting to consider what technology exists in this world, because the world seems to be somewhat mixed between technologically advanced and not. For instance, the bishops ride horses to track down Clancy and other escapees, but at the same time, we see cars being driven, and it has been confirmed, per the I Am Clancy video, that took place in the world of Dima. So cars do exist, and they seem like more retro cars from what we have seen. So perhaps this is a story based before the turn of the century. But yes, it is clear that there is a certain level of modern technology which exists in Dima and Trench more broadly, but it's not fully modern day. It's still a bit older, and technology which is more from the past. AS-PB7HQ writes, so something I thought about this morning while re-listening to Clancy is Tyler overcompensating and only seeing red. Could be why he's flying by the dangerous bend symbols, ignoring all the obvious warnings of going against the plan, and wanting to go straight for the throat of Nico and the bishops, acting recklessly and then ultimately becoming like a bishop rather than being better. Obviously, to a certain extent, we know this is true. We see it outlined in the first song on Clancy that he is flying by the dangerous bend symbol, the warning signs, and has to overcompensate for his mistakes as a result of that. Now, because we don't know exactly what the plan was when the Banditos set out from their camp to attack the city of Dima, it's a little hard to say whether or not Clancy did turn away from or ignore the plan. It has been my assumption that the plan always was for him to go and face Nico in the tower while the Torchbearer and the Banditos were creating a diversion against the Glorious Gone and the seized vessels. But even if that is the case, it doesn't eliminate the idea of acting recklessly. If you consider the current bishops of Dima to be the warning sign, the example of absolute power misused, and then you see his letter to the Torchbearer saying that he now is going to be an example of absolute power, that could be seen as recklessness, completely ignoring the dangerous bend symbol, ignoring how absolute power has gone wrong in the past, and assuming that he can be the one to do it right. And maybe he can. It isn't necessarily true that Clancy seizing absolute power for himself is going to be the end of the freedom of Dima or something like that. It may still be the best way forward, because there probably needs to be some kind of rulership instituted in place in Dima. But the way in which he's going about it, and particularly given the context of the Torchbearer's prior letter to Clancy, it does seem concerning, but not necessarily outrightly wrong. But that could be an example of him ignoring the warning signs, acting recklessly, and going straight for a position of leadership just after having torn down that same leadership in Dima. A lot of this, at this point, cannot be more than purely speculative as we wait to see what is going to come next. And assuming that we get a music video for the contract, which I would be very surprised if we didn't, I'm very curious to see what will take place in that song. Ion K7U writes, I have a question for Perligo Ponders. Why does Clancy write to the Torchbearer? Isn't the Torchbearer's power to guide? Shouldn't Clancy just be able to talk to the Torchbearer? Given what we saw in the music video for Navigating, and given my theory that throughout the entirety of the Scaled and Icy era, we don't actually see the Torchbearer, we just see a projection of him in Clancy's mind. My guess would be that no, Clancy is not able to just talk to the Torchbearer at any time, especially not when he's starting to turn away from the Torchbearer, and perhaps the Torchbearer is trying to reach out and guide him, use his power to appear where Clancy needs him and guide him and show him the way. But Clancy is refusing to acknowledge him, as we saw at the end of the Clancy tour. And so the Torchbearer resorts to writing to him, since he is still at a distance and can't force him into conversation the same way he could if they were actually standing face to face. Now, all these letters are a little strange in that we do not understand perfectly the context in which they are being written. Because certainly the exchange between the Torchbearer and Clancy and some of the other letters indicate that the defeat of Nico has already taken place. Certainly the context of the Torchbearer's letter has to be that Clancy has defeated Nico and is now setting up his rule in Dima, and the Torchbearer, not able to get access to him physically, is writing letters to him saying, you know, slow down, don't be so reckless, remember where you came from, remember why you started this fight in the first place. But we don't know that because we haven't seen that. The last we saw was Clancy in the middle of a battle, and he certainly was not in the position to read any letters at that moment. So it certainly is a little strange, given that Tyler said the show was supposed to be a flashback of why we fight before we fight, that those letters seem to have come after the fight that we have not yet seen, or at least the end of the fight that we have not yet seen. J.C. Bentley writes, in response to a video which I made discussing the Battle of Paladin Strait, I read somewhere that the banditos might be spirits of free souls, and the undead of the neon gravestones are not, thus being seized to be used against any intruder. The battle of good versus evil spirits. Like how Isle of Flightless Birds notes, the angels and demons fight over a person. Clancy might just be having visions all alone of what's happening over the fight for his soul. It's so beautiful to look at this whole thing from that perspective. I don't actually have much more to add to this comment, but I wanted to highlight it because it is a very good theory, and it doesn't seem like it's all that far off from what could be actually happening. Certainly in a more metaphorical, metaphysical sense, that very much could be what's underpinning this entire story. And again, as I've mentioned many times, I do think that the self-titled album is sort of the Spark Notes collection of everything which then came later. And certainly a lot of the visual imagery that we saw in Paladin Strait, while not lining up exactly with what is described in Isle of Flightless Birds, is very reminiscent of those verses, particularly with the battle happening as these vultures are circling around above them. Now, it's not exactly the same as angels and demons flying above during the climax of the story, but it is visually similar. It definitely, in my mind, invoked a similar sort of visual response. And it certainly seemed to me to be intentionally reminiscent of those verses and what is described in that song. And certainly those lines from Isle of Flightless Birds, I fight with no hope and no fear, are similar in spirit to what we see in Paladin Strait, the idea of being past the point of no return, but putting your money where your mouth is and doing your best to stay true to what you believe nonetheless, even though you think all is lost and all is hopeless. On a somewhat different note, Elias writes this: the problem I have with Oldies Station is while it is uplifting and hopeful, it doesn't ever really give you reasons why you should push on through. I have to disagree. While I do understand what Elias means here, that Oldies Station doesn't quite explicitly lay out a bunch of deep philosophical reasons why you should push on through. Here's where hope exactly is found. It does point to it quite clearly in the song, but I think does so in a way which represents how or what has been inspiring Tyler to push on through. But at the same time, it does so in a way which is more of a descriptive statement rather than a prescriptive explanation. And really what it's pointing to and what Tyler is describing he finds this hope in is in more mundane everyday things rather than some deep philosophically abstract theory or concept, which may be more universally broadly applicable to people. But I still think what they did, or what he wrote here in Oldies Station, is he provides an example. And you can take that example as an example and apply it to your own life. So he talks about you push on through and you're able to find joy in life in spite of whatever it is that may be troubling you. Things like being in the audience as your daughter does her dance recital. Now that doesn't apply to everyone. Doesn't apply to people who don't have children. Doesn't even apply to people who don't have daughters. But at the same time, it provides an example of something which is pretty normal, not awe-inspiring. It's just a simple moment. And being able to understand and appreciate the joy that is found in more mundane, everyday things, rather than some abstract thing which you might not ever be able to understand how to apply to your life. Now, that's not to say that those abstract philosophical understandings of hope are not important. They certainly are. But that doesn't mean that the lack of them in a song like this means that there is a lack of examples of how to push on through and find hope again in your life. Now, perhaps I'm missing the point of what Elias was saying here, and if so, feel free to comment further, but that is my interpretation of what Tyler is doing in the song, Oldies Station. Mogul Boy 1152 asks, I am so lost. There's 21 Pilots lore? Yes. With that being said, thank you for watching, and as I mentioned at the beginning, if you would like your comment or question to be featured in next month's episode of Perligo Ponders, just leave a comment with a question or a theory related to any of this. And don't forget to subscribe for more music commentary and reviews.